Titan Financial Bank was built on power, control, and ego, where the rich were served first and the rest were made to wait. But today, they made the wrong man wait. For 2 hours he sat silently, unnoticed, dismissed as a nobody. By the time they realized who he really was, it was too late. Because the man they ignored wasn't just a client, he was their new CEO, and he was about to change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The glass doors of Titan Financial Bank slid open with a soft hiss as a man stepped inside. He wasn't the kind to draw immediate attention. His suit was understated, tailored to fit but lacking any flashy brand labels. His shoes, polished but not extravagant, clicked lightly against the marble floors. The man moved with quiet confidence, his gaze sweeping across the expansive banking hall, noting every detail with an almost imperceptible sharpness. Behind the long counter, rows of tellers attended to a mix of impatient customers and polite clients. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the faint hum of distant conversations, and the occasional mechanical beep of the bank's security doors blended into an ambient soundscape of controlled chaos. At the reception desk, a young woman with professionally rehearsed politeness looked up as the man approached. "Welcome to Titan Financial. How may I assist you today?" she asked, her fingers still hovering over her keyboard. The man offered a measured smile. "I'd like to meet with the branch manager, Mr. Calloway." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. People didn't just ask to meet the branch manager, not without an appointment. Her smile remained, but it tightened just slightly. "Do you have a scheduled meeting with him?" she inquired, reaching for her system to check. The man shook his head. "No, but it's important." She hesitated. "May I have your name?" He exhaled lightly, as if considering whether it mattered. Then he replied, "James. Just James. No last name, no business title, no explanation." The receptionist glanced at the opaque glass office in the far corner where Mr. Calloway was seated. The manager had a reputation, a man who prided himself on control, dismissing people at will, often indulging his own sense of self-importance. She knew how this would play out. "Mr. Calloway is very busy today," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But if you'd like, you can take a seat. I'll see if he's available." James nodded. He neither argued nor insisted, just turned and walked towards the seating area near the main floor. His expression gave nothing away. Inside his corner office, Mr. Calloway barely glanced up from his screen when the receptionist informed him about the man waiting outside. He leaned back in his leather chair, unimpressed. "No appointment?" he repeated, almost amused. "Who does he think he is?" "He didn't say much, just that it was important," she replied, shifting uncomfortably. Calloway smirked. "Important?" Everyone thought their business was important. "Let him wait," he said dismissively, already turning his focus back to the reports on his screen. And so, James waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The bank's operations continued as usual. Clients came and went, staff whispered, phones rang. But James remained seated, silent, watchful. 2 hours passed. James's posture never changed. His expression never flickered with impatience. He simply sat there, waiting, observing, taking note of everything. But the real mistake had already been made. And soon, Mr. Calloway was going to find out just how big of a mistake it was. The atmosphere inside Titan Financial Bank buzzed with the controlled chaos of a weekday afternoon. Customers filtered in and out, some in a hurry, others taking their time. But amidst the constant movement, one man remained unchanged. James sat exactly where he had been instructed to wait, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. He neither checked his watch nor displayed any sign of frustration. But while James remained still, everything around him shifted. Behind the counter, bank tellers sneaked occasional glances in his direction. At first, it was mere curiosity, just another walk-in customer waiting for an audience with their ever-busy manager. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, their interest turned into something else entirely. A few exchanged knowing smirks, their eyes gleaming with amusement. They had seen this before. It wasn't uncommon for Mr. Calloway to make people wait. The man thrived on control, power was his game, and delaying meetings was one of his favorite tactics. To him, it wasn't about being busy. It was about making people feel small. From inside his glass-walled office, Calloway glanced up, his sharp blue eyes landing on the still-seated figure of James. A slow smirk curled at the corner of his lips. Let him wait. Let him squirm. This wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about establishing a hierarchy, a pecking order. Calloway had worked his way up from a mid-level banker to the branch manager of one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the city. He had made powerful connections, rubbed shoulders with influential figures, and controlled millions in assets. And yet, this man, this nobody, had walked in expecting to meet him? Just like that? Calloway leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders. The receptionist had informed him that the man had given only one name, James, and no further details. No title, no company name, no reason for urgency. That alone was enough for Calloway to dismiss him. Men like him came in all the time. Small business owners, hopeful investors, desperate loan applicants, each believing their case was special, each assuming they deserved a meeting. But here, inside these walls, Calloway decided who was important. Out on the floor, James continued to observe. Every movement, every conversation, every reaction. A customer in an expensive suit approached one of the tellers, asking for assistance with a large wire transfer. The teller, who had barely acknowledged James when he first entered, immediately stood up straighter, her tone shifting into one of polished professionalism. Minutes later, an elderly woman hesitantly walked up to the same teller, fumbling with her paperwork, her voice trembling as she struggled to explain her issue. This time, the teller's tone changed. The warmth in her voice vanished, replaced with thinly veiled impatience. The woman was given short, clipped responses, no effort made to assist beyond the bare minimum. James's gaze didn't waver, but he had already noted the difference. This bank functioned on a hierarchy, one dictated not by need, but by perceived worth. The employees followed their leader's example, and their leader was a man who thrived on ego. Inside his office, Calloway had moved on from James entirely. He was now engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, boasting. Yeah, got drinks last night with some of the guys from corporate, he was telling one of his senior bankers, his voice carrying just enough to ensure nearby employees could overhear. Big players. People who actually matter in this business. The other banker nodded eagerly, hanging on to every word. Calloway thrived on these moments when he could remind his subordinates just how connected he was. You know, it's funny, he continued, swirling the coffee in his hand like it was a glass of whiskey. People think walking in here means they get a seat at the table, like access is free. He scoffed, shaking his head. If you don't have the right name, the right network, you're nobody. His words were deliberate, as though they were meant for an unseen audience. And in a way they were. He knew that beyond the glass walls of his office, his employees were listening, absorbing. But what Calloway didn't know was that the wrong person was also listening. James, still seated in the same waiting area, had heard everything. And while his posture remained composed, there was a subtle shift, a glint in his eyes, just for a fraction of a second. The balance of power had already begun to shift. The manager thought he was winning, but in reality, he was simply playing into the hands of a man who never lost. And soon, he would realize his mistake. The rhythmic ticking of the bank's wall clock was the only indication of time moving forward. Hours had passed since James first walked through the doors, yet his position remained unchanged. He sat with the same calm expression, the same quiet patience, as if the concept of waiting held no consequence for him. The bank, however, continued its usual rhythm. Customers arrived, transactions were processed, employees whispered, and somewhere in the background Mr. Calloway thrived on his own self-importance. At some point, the receptionist passed by James, offering an apologetic look. She didn't have to say anything. The message was clear. He wasn't getting that meeting anytime soon. Another half-hour dragged by before James finally stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were giving the moment space to breathe before making his next move. Without hesitation, He walked back to the receptionist's desk. "Would you mind checking with Mr. Calloway again?" His voice was even, polite, completely devoid of irritation. "I believe I've waited long enough." The receptionist hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't want to help. There was something about this man, something composed yet undeniably firm, that made her feel like he wasn't someone to brush off. But she also knew Calloway's temperament. With a quiet sigh, she picked up the phone, dialing the extension. Inside his glass-walled office, Calloway was halfway through yet another exaggerated story when the call interrupted him. Annoyed, he snatched the receiver. "What?" The receptionist's voice came through, cautious yet clear. "Sir, the gentleman from earlier is still waiting. He's asking again if you'd be able to meet with him." Calloway's eyebrows shot up. Still waiting. That was new. Usually people got the hint after an hour or two. They left, tail tucked between their legs, realizing they weren't important enough to demand his time. But this one had waited. For hours. A slow smirk stretched across his face. Ridiculous. He stood, pushing open the door to his office and stepping into the main floor. His eyes landed on James, still standing by the receptionist's desk. And then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, Calloway scoffed. "You're still here?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. My God, some people just don't get it. A few employees turned to watch. A couple of customers glanced over, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. James didn't react. He simply met Calloway's gaze, unwavering. But the manager wasn't done. "I mean, really," Calloway continued, his tone dripping with mockery. "What exactly do you think is going to happen here? That if you sit around long enough, I'll magically decide you're worth my time?" He gave a short, cold laugh. "That's not how the world works, buddy." A few of the tellers grinned, some exchanging amused glances. The security guard near the entrance chuckled under his breath. The humiliation was intentional. Calloway had seen it before. The way public belittling broke people down. How a well-timed insult, delivered in front of an audience, could strip a man of his dignity. But James? James didn't break. He didn't flinch, didn't fumble for words, didn't even shift uncomfortably. He just stood there, calm as ever, watching Calloway with an expression that was impossible to read. And for the first time, something in the air changed. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't loud. But it was there. A quiet, almost imperceptible ripple of unease. A realization, spreading through the room like a slow-moving storm. This man wasn't like the others. Calloway sensed it too, though he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he let out one final scoff and turned away. "Get out of my bank," he muttered, shaking his head as he walked back toward his office. He didn't see it, but everyone else did. The way James's expression shifted, just slightly. The way his patience, so carefully controlled, settled into something else entirely. The shift had happened. And now, the storm was coming. Calloway had barely settled back into his chair when the sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. His office door hadn't even fully closed before James walked in uninvited, stepping past the threshold with the same quiet confidence he had carried since the moment he arrived. Calloway's smirk vanished. His brows furrowed in irritation. "Excuse me?" he snapped, straightening in his chair. "I don't recall inviting you in." James shut the door behind him, not forcefully, not aggressively, but with purpose. The soft click of the latch sounded far too final, as if the air had thickened, the temperature in the room dropping a few degrees. For the first time all day, Calloway felt a shift in control. James took a slow step forward, then another, and then, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a single sealed envelope and placed it neatly on Calloway's desk. "Before you say anything else," James said, his voice even, unwavering, commanding, "I think you should read this." Calloway stared at the envelope, then back up at James. The absolute lack of hesitation in the man's demeanor sent a small flicker of unease through him. "Still," Calloway scoffed, picking up the envelope as if it were beneath him. He ripped it open, eyes skimming over the contents, his posture rigid, his breath catching just slightly. And then, his fingers tightened around the paper, his face paled. The bolded words at the top of the document sent a white-hot shock through his system. Notice of executive restructuring, effective immediately. Calloway's stomach dropped. No, this wasn't possible. His eyes darted over the fine print, desperately seeking some sort of misunderstanding, some loophole that would allow him to dismiss this as a clerical error. But there wasn't one. The legal wording was absolute. Ironclad. He felt his pulse pounding in his ears as he reached the final lines of the document, where the new CEO's name was printed in bold letters, James Sterling. The same nobody he had been making a fool of all afternoon. Calloway's grip on the paper tightened further, but his body refused to move. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. His chest felt constricted, his thoughts spiraling in real time. He looked up. James was still standing there, his expression calm, unshaken, like a storm that had already made landfall, unstoppable, inevitable. Seconds passed. The weight of silence inside the office grew suffocating. Outside the glass walls, employees had noticed something was wrong. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see Calloway's reaction. And that reaction said everything. James tilted his head slightly, watching Calloway with a quiet, measured patience, letting the man's own disbelief consume him. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not just some guy who walked in off the street, Mr. Calloway." His voice remained steady, unwavering. "I own this bank now." The words landed like a gunshot. Calloway's breathing grew shallow. The employees outside had stopped what they were doing, exchanging confused glances, trying to piece together the scene unraveling before them. The same man they had laughed at, ignored, treated like an inconvenience. He was their new boss. The weight of realization crashed through the room in waves, like an electric current surging through every single person present. Calloway's fingers trembled slightly, though he quickly curled them into a fist, forcing himself to hold on to some shred of dignity. This is a joke," he muttered, though the lack of confidence in his own voice betrayed him. He shook his head, gripping the paper tighter, as if somehow his refusal to accept the reality could change it. "You can't be serious." James let a small pause linger in the air before responding. He didn't need to convince Calloway. The truth was already staring him in the face. "I think you'll find," James said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that I am." The words settled into the air, unshakable, irrefutable. And Calloway knew at that moment that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside the glass walls of the office, the once steady rhythm of the bank had begun to fracture. The whispers started slow, barely audible at first, but like a wildfire catching a dry forest, they spread. Employees stole glances at one another, their confusion giving way to silent understanding. The pieces were beginning to fit. The man who had sat in silence for hours. The one they had ignored, dismissed, humiliated. He was the new CEO. The weight of the realization settled over the floor like a heavy fog, stifling and unshakable. Conversations hushed, transactions slowed. Even the customers, though unaware of the full story, could sense the unease creeping through the air. And inside the office, Calloway was unraveling. His confidence, the same confidence that had dripped with arrogance and superiority mere moments ago, was crumbling before their eyes. His fingers clutched the legal notice, knuckles whitening, his lips parting as if to speak. But nothing came out. His mind, always so quick with cutting remarks and dismissive authority, now fumbled for words that refused to come. James, however, remained unchanged. His stance, his demeanor, his unshaken presence. It was the exact same as when he had first walked into the bank. That was the most terrifying part. This wasn't a man who had been waiting for a victory. He had already won the moment he stepped through the doors. Calloway finally found his voice, though it wasn't nearly as strong as before. This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, shaking his head as if that alone could erase reality. His breathing was uneven, his carefully curated facade of power cracking apart like shattered glass. James took his time before responding. He let the silence linger just long enough for the discomfort to fully settle. Then, with a quiet but commanding voice, he spoke. "Oh, it makes perfect sense, Calloway." James took a step closer to the desk, his gaze steady, his voice like the calm before a storm. You thought power was about how long you could make a man wait, how many people you could humiliate, how much you could take without giving anything back. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You didn't run a bank. You ran a kingdom built on ego. Calloway flinched, his fingers still gripping the document as if it could somehow save him. James wasn't done. I watched you today, he continued, his voice sharp but never raised. I watched how you treated your employees, how you chose who mattered and who didn't based on nothing more than your own arrogance. He let his gaze flicker toward the glass, toward the employees who were now completely invested in every word being spoken. I saw how you belittled a receptionist who was just doing her job, how you ignored a waiting client because you assumed he wasn't worth your time. Calloway's eyes flickered toward the employees outside the office, and that was when he realized the real damage. They were listening, all of them. The same people who had laughed at James earlier, the same staff who had followed Calloway's lead without question. They were watching their once untouchable leader lose his grip on everything. And some of them were starting to look at James with something they had never given Calloway. Respect, James continued, his voice steady but edged with an authority that could not be ignored. A manager sets the standard for how a business operates, he said. And this bank? It's inefficient, unethical, and unprofessional. Because of you. The words were like a blade, cutting straight through Calloway's defenses. I've read your reports, James went on. I know about the complaints, the turnover rate, the clients we've lost because of your inability to treat them with respect. He tilted his head slightly. And you thought none of it mattered, because you thought no one was watching. Calloway's breathing had turned shallow, his hands clammy, his mind scrambling for an escape, an excuse, anything to reverse what was happening. This is ridiculous, he sputtered, his voice lacking the venom it once held. You don't know how things work here. You can't just walk in and... James cut him off with a simple, lethal statement. I don't need to know how things used to work, he said, his tone final. Because starting today, they work my way. And just like that, the last ounce of Calloway's control collapsed. The weight of the room pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. The employees who had once feared him now watched him with pity, or worse, indifference. James had done what Calloway had never been able to do. He had earned their loyalty, without demanding it. And now, Calloway stood alone, exposed and completely powerless. Calloway could feel it, the walls closing in, the weight of his own downfall pressing down on him like an iron grip around his throat. He had always been in control, always the man people feared, respected, obeyed without question. But now, standing in his own office, stripped of authority, he was nothing more than a relic of a past that had just been erased. His fingers trembled slightly as he set the document down on his desk, trying to mask the unease creeping into his bones. His mouth opened, but no sharp remark came this time, no cruel dismissal or scoff to wave away reality. Instead, his voice came out strained, uncertain. This is a misunderstanding, he muttered, forcing a chuckle that held no real amusement. James, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're taking things out of context. James didn't move. He didn't even blink. I saw everything I needed to see, he said, his tone colder than before. Calloway swallowed hard. He could feel the eyes outside the glass, the way his own employees were watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none with the fear they once had for him. He needed to fix this. This is business, Calloway continued, his voice growing more desperate. You don't get to the top by playing nice with everyone. You have to be firm, demand results. He gestured vaguely toward the staff outside. If you go easy on them, they'll walk all over you. James let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. The excuses, the justifications, the complete inability to see the truth staring him in the face. You think this is about being firm? James asked, his voice carrying through the room with quiet finality. You didn't run this bank with strength, Calloway. You ran it with ego. Calloway opened his mouth to argue, but James didn't give him the chance. You belittled your employees to make yourself feel important, James continued. You mistreated customers based on how valuable you decided they were. You encouraged a culture of fear and arrogance instead of professionalism and respect. He took a step forward, and Calloway, for the first time, leaned back slightly. You convinced yourself that power is something you take, James said, his voice lowering just slightly. But real power? It's earned. And today, you just lost every ounce of it. The tension in the office was suffocating now. Every employee outside had stopped working. They weren't even pretending to be busy anymore. The shift in authority had already happened, even if Calloway refused to accept it. Calloway knew it too. He could see it in the way his employees avoided his gaze. The ones who had once followed his every order without hesitation were now distancing themselves, some even exchanging uneasy glances. He had never been truly respected, only feared. And now that fear was gone. One of the assistant managers, a man who had worked under Calloway for years, suddenly cleared his throat. When Calloway looked at him, he flinched. "Sir, He hesitated, then quickly shifted his gaze to James. "Mr. Sterling, I just want to say that we had no idea who you were earlier. If we had known, James raised a hand, cutting him off mid-excuse. His expression was unreadable. "I don't care how you treated me," he said simply. Then his eyes flickered toward Calloway. "I care about how this bank is run." Calloway let out a sharp breath, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was losing everything, and no one was going to save him. Calloway stiffened. "You're done here," James stated. "Effective immediately." The words hit like a death sentence. Calloway's face twisted, his skin turning a shade paler. He shook his head violently, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the polished floor. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice raw with desperation. "I built this branch. I brought in clients. I put in years of my life. And in those years," James interrupted, his voice controlled, unshaken, "you built a culture of fear, inefficiency, and corruption. I read the reports. I saw the numbers. You weren't building a business, Calloway. You were running a kingdom where you were the only one who mattered." Calloway's breathing was uneven now, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands twitching at his sides. James exhaled. "If you want to argue, take it up with the board," he said coolly. "Oh, wait." He let a small pause linger, then delivered the final blow. "They already signed off on your termination." Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. The last bit of color drained from Calloway's face. This was it. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a power struggle. It was over. And outside the office, the staff who had once followed him, once feared him, once laughed alongside him at the expense of others. They had already moved on. The power shift had been undeniable. And Calloway? He was no longer part of it. Calloway stood frozen. The walls of his world had crumbled in a matter of minutes, and no amount of power, pride, or defiance could piece them back together. His breath came in shallow bursts, his fists still clenched at his sides, as if holding on to the last remnants of his authority. James had just destroyed him. The man who had sat patiently for hours, the man Calloway had mocked, humiliated, dismissed as a nobody. He had come not as a client, not as an underling, but as the owner of everything Calloway thought he controlled. And yet, James didn't look at him with gloating satisfaction. There was no smirk of victory, no sharp-tongued insult to rub salt in the wound. Instead, James simply regarded him with a calm, measured expression, as if Calloway were nothing more than another decision to be made. "You have two options," James said, his voice even, deliberate. "You can pack your things and walk out of here today. No lawsuits, no public humiliation. Just leave with whatever dignity you have left." The words struck like a hammer. Calloway stiffened. He knew what that meant. A quiet exit. No scandal, no headlines. He would be erased from the bank's history, his name forgotten within weeks. But James wasn't finished. "Or," he continued, his tone shifting just slightly, "you stay. Under me. Under my rules." A hush fell over the room. Calloway blinked. The employees outside, who had been waiting for the final blow, suddenly exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the clean-cut ending they had expected. Even Calloway looked momentarily stunned. James tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You claim you built this place," he said. "That you brought in clients, kept the numbers high, held this bank together." His gaze sharpened. "So prove it." The silence in the room was deafening. Calloway opened his mouth, but for the first time in his life, he had no immediate response. James continued, his voice unyielding. "You stay, and you fix what you broke." A beat passed. No more favoritism, no more arrogance, no more treating employees like they're beneath you. He let the weight of his words settle before adding, "You answer to me. Every decision, every policy, every interaction, you do it my way, or you don't do it at all." The words were a lifeline and a noose at the same time. Calloway could feel the eyes on him. The employees who had once feared him, who had followed his lead without question, were now watching not with reverence, but with curiosity. Would he take the offer? Could he? The man who had spent years ruling with an iron fist, who had thrived on power, control, and dominance. Could he now submit? Calloway's jaw tightened. His pride screamed at him to walk away, to leave this place with whatever dignity he had left. But dignity wouldn't pay his mortgage, wouldn't rebuild his reputation, wouldn't keep him from being forgotten. The room felt too small, too suffocating, as he struggled with the decision James had forced upon him. James didn't push. He simply watched, waiting, letting Calloway battle with the weight of his own ego. The employees held their breath. And then, in a moment so subtle it almost went unnoticed, Calloway's shoulders dropped. It wasn't a defeat. Not yet. But it was something close. His lips parted, just slightly, as if to speak. His fingers twitched at his sides. The choice was his. But was it already too late? Outside, the world continued as usual. Transactions, signatures, bank slips exchanged hands. But inside, in that small glass-walled office, a man's entire legacy hung in the balance. And no one, not even James, knew what he would decide. Power isn't about possession. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. Do you lead with respect or with fear? Because fear fades the moment real authority walks in. Calloway thought he was untouchable, but in the end, he was just another man drowning in his own arrogance. How many others are blind to the cracks beneath them, ignoring the inevitable fall? When the moment of reckoning comes, will you stand with power or be left with nothing?